My name is Libby Bischoff, and I am the Executive Director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education here at the University of Southern Maine on a pretty stunning spring evening in the state of Maine, our first. So thank you so much to all who have joined us virtually as we welcome Laura Bliss of Bloomberg CityLab virtually to the Osher Map Library, but we hope also in person in the not too distant future. It's great to have folks from Maine and around the region and around the country with us this evening. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's talk, which is about a really fascinating project that began during quarantine in April of 2020 and involved participants from around the world, the newly published Quarantine Atlas. This evening, Laura will present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a moderated Q&A. As this is a Zoom webinar, we invite you to put any questions that you might have in the chat as we move over, in the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen as we move throughout the webinar, and we will answer as many questions as we possibly can. We also have live captioning available this evening. So if you would love to turn that feature on, if that would be helpful for you, you can just push the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I just want to say I have a really special interest in this project as a public historian. Just around the same time that CityLab began collecting homemade maps of the way people's daily lives and routines and routes were changing, I began collecting digital images of signs all over the Southern Maine region for a project called Signs of the Times, documenting COVID-19 signs in Southern Maine, which has been crowdsourced, asking people to submit signs from schools, businesses, people's front lawns, parks, any place that you can imagine, theater marquees that have marked the various phases of the pandemic, from lockdown to reopening to vaccines and testing and everything in between. And I knew that capturing these changing times as they unfolded through things that were very ephemeral would help future residents of Maine, as well as future scholars, really try to understand this difficult time period that we're still living through. And as many cultural historians understand, and as certainly as many of you understand, the hardest thing to capture about previous time periods is people's lived experience of day-to-day life. And so trying to really capture the lived experience of day-to-day life in a region through the pandemic was really important. So we are all united as people who have lived and worked and learned through an unprecedented global pandemic. And I'm really excited to hear Laura talk more about what led to the creation of the Quarantine Atlas. I will put the link for Signs of the Times in the chat alongside the digital companion exhibit to the Osher Map Library and Smith Center's physical exhibit, Where Do We Go From Here? Travel in the Age of COVID-19. That was a crowdsourced exhibit we did in 2021 that asked people where they didn't go during lockdown and COVID, and then we matched their personal narratives with historic maps, which turned out to be a really moving documentation of the ways in which the restricted geographic area of people's lives really impacted their relationships with friends and family and loved ones through the missing of milestones and also the way in which work had profoundly changed. So I really think that learning from these COVID archives, these exhibits, these personal narratives, the maps that we'll see this evening, help us all to process and move through the ongoing and collective grief and trauma of all we have lost during the pandemic that's still with us. So Laura, we're so excited to hear more about your project. And without further ado, to all those watching, let me introduce our special guest. Laura Bliss is a journalist at Bloomberg CityLab, where she reports on urban policy and politics and authors the bi-weekly newsletter that I very much encourage you to sign up for, called Map Lab, which looks at how cartography and geography intersect with news and daily life. Really shows us the continual and sometimes surprising ways in which all sorts of maps remain relevant, which is something we're constantly trying to hammer home in the map library. So I know that you have appreciative readers in this building anyways. She is most recently the editor of the book, The Quarantine Atlas, which is a collection of 65 maps designed by people all over the world during COVID-19 with 8 accompanying original essays. And it was just published. So we will also put the link momentarily to that in the chat so folks can check it out for yourself. Her articles and essays have been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Bloomberg, Business Week, and so many more. So Laura, thank you so much for being with us this evening. And I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Woohoo! Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Libby. It is a tremendous honor to be here. And I'm so glad this has been a long planned event, and the timing has just like worked out so well with the book finally coming out. But yeah, it's been so much fun to plan this with you. So thank you, Libby, and thank you, Jess and Cameron and everyone who's putting this event together. And thank you to everyone who's here tonight out there. I cannot see you, but I feel your presence. And I know that we are at the Map Center in spirit together. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. Yes, this one, share. Okay. You can see my messy desktop, and I'm going to go in a slideshow. Okay, can everybody see that?
You are good, Laura.
Great. Okay, and no distracting screen sharing bar, I hope. Okay, so yes, like Libby was describing, this presentation tonight is about the Quarantine Atlas. And so that is the name of the book that we just published at CityLab last month, which is now available everywhere books are sold. But it's also what we've been calling an audience engagement project that we've been leading as part of our journalism at CityLab for the last 2 years. And that started, in April 2020 in the first blush of pandemic lockdowns worldwide. And so this is the cover of our beautiful book, which I will be talking more about later. But first, I'm going to talk about what Bloomberg CityLab is and kind of how maps are part of our journalism and the day-to-day work that we do, and how this project really was born of that. So just a little bit about CityLab first. It is a vertical of Bloomberg News. So we are a publication that covers urban politics and policy. So transportation, housing, justice, environmental issues, technology, architecture, sort of all the things that you might find in a city, and issues that affect local places, local communities. That's what we cover, and we do it for an international audience, or people who are interested in cities and kind of what make them tick. And not just cities, places. And so as part of that kind of interest in place and storytelling about place, we write a lot about maps. And I, as part of my work as a reporter and editor at CityLab, I'm the author of Map Lab, like Libby said, which is our biweekly newsletter about how maps intersect with the news and shed light on the world around us. So every 2 weeks, you'll get in your inbox a story or a little history or a fascinating project by a map maker that illuminate those issues. And so this is just a little sort of teaser for some recent Map Lab editions. And also that's the link, bloomberg.com/newsletters, if you're interested in signing up to see what it's all about. And then just a little bit about, how maps are just part of our journalism on a day-to-day basis, aside from the Map Lab newsletter. So obviously, journalists use maps in all kinds of reporting, and that is definitely true for me as a reporter, and really across the Bloomberg newsroom. We're very into data. And so, we might make a map to accompany a story, whether that's about, these maps are looking at sort of before and after traffic patterns from the first few months of the pandemic. We might make a map that looks at where traffic accidents are occurring in cities to sort of pinpoint hotspots, or where people are rebuilding houses and the scars left by a wildfire. So all kinds of ways that we use cartography and maps to accompany and really accentuate our storytelling. And then for me, as someone who writes this newsletter about maps and is so fascinated by them, I'm also really interested in maps and writing about maps from almost like a media critic perspective or like metacritical perspective. So an example of that is, would be an article I wrote in November 2020 around the last presidential election, looking at how there's often these kind of missteps in representing or mapping election results or election sort of predictions. So this map that you're seeing, a really blurry version of, but this was something that President Trump tweeted around that time, try to impeach this, and it shows this landscape just like saturated in red, and that's counties mapped by how they were expected to vote right in the election, and it really gives a sense of just sweeping victories for Republicans. But of course, land doesn't vote; people do. That's kind of the adage in the cartography world, so to speak. And we know that blue counties do win national elections because population centers, right, are important factors. And so thinking about how maps can misrepresent data and tell stories that might not actually be true to reality all of the time.
Laura, I'm just going to interrupt you for one quick sec.
Sure.
We see some gray bars on your screen. So Cam says you just need to click the minimize sign on the video view, if that makes any sense.
Minimize view on the video view.
Yeah, if you see the
Can you see
the couple the video faces of
okay. Yes,
yeah, if you just minimize it.
Is that better?
Go ahead and share slideshow again.
How's that?
Perfect. And you might be able to move that little bar over to like another screen by chance, if that's possible.
Okay, I will try that. Yep. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. There are a couple of them. Well, there's one on the top and one on the bottom. Perfect. You just need to move them. There we go.
I can't move this one to another screen.
But you can move it to the bottom. That's fine.
Yeah. Okay. It's at the bottom.
Perfect. Thank you, Laura. Sorry about that.
No worries. So yeah, okay, those kinds of maps. And then finally, talking about how maps are part of my journalism and I think are an important journalistic tool. I think the last sort of way that that's true is maps as a tool for connection, for empathy and understanding other perspectives. And so an example of this is this series I edited in 2019 called The Maps That Made Us. And this was a series of personal essays by authors who had some connection to a map that changed their lives or that really informed a kind of world perspective. And these stories were really moving and very personal and kind of illuminated the ways that you can look at a map as a sort of window into another person's world. And this one was by Nicole Antebbe, who's an artist and is very interested in the ways that the Rio Grande River, Rio Bravo, as it's known on the Mexican border side, is kind of ever changing and resisting the sort of confines that the two countries put on it as a border. So thinking about all those ways that maps really inform our journalism, that's really where this project was born out of. So get back into that rather traumatic mindset of spring 2020. I'm, as a journalist, thinking about how do I, so much of my job normally is going outside, it's talking to people, it is having an insight into other people's worlds and lives, into what's happening in other communities. It's what I do as a reporter. And that was really constrained, right, in April 2020, when so many of us, literally billions of people around the world, were not, were being told to stay home. And my colleague at CityLab, Jessica Martin, who is our audience engagement editor, which means she's in charge of our social media, she's in charge of kind of reaching our readers and engaging them and making sure they're getting the kind of journalism they want and need. we put our heads together and came up with this project of asking people, our readers, to make a map of what their world in this new upside down kind of world, so full of uncertainty and fear and this new virus and having to stay home, having to do all these new things when you go outside. What did their worlds look like through this kind of simple assignment of a homemade map? And so the first call out we put out to readers was in April 2020. We put out subsequent call outs, kind of asking for more. This was just a little Instagram post we made. It's a little GIF that shows people how to participate. So create a map that tells the story of 2020, you can send it in. We also had a sort of survey link that accompanied the sort of webpage where people submitted their maps, where they could also share a story. They could explain their map and kind of narrate it a little bit. So we got the maps and also the stories in the words of our map makers. And the response was really overwhelming. I don't really know what we anticipated, but what we received was definitely above and beyond. By the end of 2020, we had more than 500 map submissions from 5 different continents, dozens from the United States. That's obviously where we're based. So that was definitely where the bulk were coming from. But, we had submissions from Nigeria, from Bolivia, from Australia, from China, from all over Europe, from Pakistan, I mean, truly from all over the planet. And just this really, really rich range of geographic diversity and kind of life experience diversity. And also the way that people were responding to this prompt was just really diverse too. And so I'm going to get into that. What's my next slide here? Oh yeah, before I get into sort of that, I just want to show you this quick video. I'll just go to the slide that our colleagues at Bloomberg Quick Take put together in 2020 that just does a really nice job of taking you closer into some of these maps, which are just beautiful. I will say that CityLab, as a website, we cover design and architecture. We do have a lot of readers who have a kind of visual sensibility. And that really showed in some of these maps, because it was like, wow, some people are really artistically gifted. But even folks who are not, professional artists, this was just such a kind of creative outpouring. And so you'll really see that in this video, and you'll also hear some of their words too. So I'll play this now.
The coronavirus pandemic has remapped everyone's worlds. How has that looked for you? CityLab is an online news magazine about urban life and places that matter. In April, we asked readers to share homemade maps depicting how the pandemic has changed their lives. Within a month, we'd received more than 300 submissions from around the world. Using pencil, watercolors, clay, found objects, and many other media, readers mapped a rich spectrum of perspectives, experiences, hopes, and frustrations, from the places they fled to the people they miss, to the nature, neighbors, and secret spots of solace they cling to. Some showed the ways their home lives had been hemmed in and rearranged by the virus outside. Many readers infused their maps with humor, like this one sheltering in her apartment in New Delhi. And this one, from California, of a relationship tested by extreme mundanity. With distractions in scarce supply, several readers turned to fantasy for inspiration. From Spain to Vietnam to Canada, neighborhoods were perceived in new ways.
The lockdown has made people scatter from the streets, and with them, cars and noise,
wrote one reader about her map of silence in surrounding Bilbao.
I found myself listening more intently as I walked and forming new dictionaries of sound in my head,
wrote another person about the sounds of Cambridge, Massachusetts. A routine walk focused the attention of this reader in Austin, Texas.
I've become cognizant of the tiny details in people's yards that reveal things about their lives.
But for a lot of people, the contrast between inside and outside felt really dark. Many maps were laced with stress and anxiety. Lonely landscapes were marked with memories of social contact. With school closures and travel restrictions appending their lives, several readers wished that they could be somewhere else other than where they were, like this college student unhappy to be back at home, and this Italian expatriate in the US missing her family in Bergamo.
Even if the pandemic has made physical distances more painful, in my heart, my beloved worlds are even closer.
Some envisioned a better world, like a Miami resident who thinks more public transit could reconnect the city once lockdowns lift. Access to nature seemed to make all the difference. In Sydney, Australia, a reader found herself looking closer at the trees on her block. In the UK, a writer sketched what she called
a beautiful old canyon near our house that looks like a lost world.
Though each submission was unique, put together these maps show how the emotional experiences of the coronavirus pandemic have been shared by people all around the world. As economies reopen and a wave of protests fill formerly empty streets, public and private spaces are shifting once again, as societies struggle to balance the sweeping impacts of the pandemic and a massive call to address systemic racism and injustice. As a powerful medium for revealing our relationships to place, these maps serve as a reminder of the ways we are still connected, especially through times of upheaval and as new futures are forged. The coronavirus pandemic has remapped every...
There we go. So I just think that video did such a great job of going deep and really showing the detail and the creativity and just the diversity of approaches that people had in terms of, you know, medium, as you heard, but also thematically. There were some really strong themes that really emerged organically from the submissions that we received. And at the top here, this is a screenshot of one of the many kind of online showcases we created at CityLab of these maps over the course of 2020 and also subsequently, because this project has continued. But in June 2020, we put together this really gorgeous sort of gallery that organized, I think it was like 80 or 90 of the maps by theme. And I'll just go through them quickly. The link to this project is at the bottom of the screen, by the way. But one of the themes is this concept of what I called domestic rearrangements. So thinking about how the literal, interiors of our homes, if you were spending more time, you really had to rearrange. Your living room was now your office, and you're going out to eat at a restaurant after work, and your place of childcare, and your kitchen was probably all those things and more. This other theme of psychic landscapes, where a lot of our map makers took this project as an opportunity to sort of dump what they were feeling and experiencing emotionally, internally onto the page and kind of give it some shape and form. Another theme, redefined boundaries. So people were thinking about the ways that, the sort of familiar boundaries of home and neighborhood and city and even country were sort of turned upside down when we were suddenly confined and constrained, and also sort of grappling with the fear of sort of entering into other people's space, right, when there was this virus spreading. And virtual connections. So this is the way that so much of life collapsed into two-dimensional virtual space for so many of us. I should say, people who were staying at home, people who were lucky enough to be staying at home for the most part, were working primarily online, might have been socializing online, might be going to see a doctor online. There was just a lot of that virtual stuff happening. And then finally, natural callings is kind of an antidote to a lot of this, where, when some of the more traditional outlets for getting out on the weekends, were no longer available, whether that's a restaurant or a bar, or, getting together with another family or a play date for your kids. People were really seeking outdoor spaces and nature, whether that was in their own neighborhoods or out at a national park or in other ways. So now I'm going to actually go through some of the maps. You can see them in their full glory in a little bit more detail, and that really kind of illuminate the themes that I just talked about and some of the diversity that we received. So this is definitely in that kind of domestic rearrangements category. This is from a map maker in North Carolina who has this great kind of almost dollhouse-like cutaway of his home, and he's showing how his different family members are making use of the home space in different ways. and this almost comic strip timeline, right, of what a day in the life looks like for all these family members. And I just love how in the middle there's also this reminder of what was kind of in the background of this otherwise pretty colorful, cheerful looking scene, is that worry and anxiety and questioning and denial, right, of what was happening outside in this moment of really deep uncertainty. This is a map that you saw in the video. It's just remained one of my favorites. It's from a map maker, Peter Conrad, who is a graphic artist. He does his own kind of comic books, and another kind of cutaway. But I just really like it. It feels very relatable. Like if you were sharing your space with a partner or a family member or a roommate day after day after day, I think it just gets at that questioning of like, do we still like each other? And that almost Marco Polo like way of interacting or speaking to each other from across, the hallway. So I just really like this one. From Indonesia, Nabila Nur Anissa, who's mapping from West Java and showing her life as a working parent, and contrasting, the real commute that she previously had, of driving an hour and 20 minutes from home to work, to now this sort of collapsed commute and collapsed boundary home life that she's experiencing and living with her young child, and the way that, the office is both her place of work and it's where she's doing her grocery shopping, and the living room is like where everything is happening all at once. I just think it does a really nice job of showing that phenomenon. Something you also saw in the video was we had a number of maps that were kind of playing with the like fantasy map genre. So like the, map of Middle Earth you see in the beginning of the Lord of the Rings books, but for your pandemic map. And so this is one of them by Stentor Danielson in Pennsylvania, who is mapping his home life, but in this sort of playful fantasy map-like style where, you have the Seeing Stone of Zoom and the Temple of the Red and Black God, which he explained in his little narrative, his Netflix, and what is the other one? Cleansing Wetlands, like that must be the bathroom. So I just thought this was really great and playful, and just kind of a reminder too, of how when I think you're living your life day in, day out in the same spaces, and those spaces just become so gratingly familiar, I think that there is something very human about, wanting to almost defamiliarize that stuff, right? And try to see something new in what has become so kind of gratingly the same. Arthur Beaubois-Jude, professional cartographer in France, who made this really beautiful kind of aerial map of his 1 kilometer sort of zone, the radius that he was allowed to travel within under French COVID rules. And I just kind of love how everything outside of this just like white space. So it's like, this impassable zone. And you see his captions are, his home and his supermarket, his grandmother, and the essentials, but nothing beyond that. Another one, I think this is a Transformed Boundaries. Now I'm forgetting the name of my theme, but from a map maker in Washington, D.C., who's mapping his neighborhood, and kind of similarly, like you can sort of get the sense of there's like a center of the map where this is where he goes. This is the bike highway where he passes every day, and the empty school and the old folks he worries about. But then there's sort of these distance areas of impassable industry and the zone of perceived threat up in the corner, which looks like the White House. So again, this idea of the kind of shrinking boundaries of the pandemic and how that felt. I just think this is a lovely, really spare map from Ranat Zaman in Queens, New York, and she's just kind of mapping her daily pandemic walk and pinpointing the places that she used to go and the places that she misses. This year I've dreamt of cake often. Virtual spaces. So this is a really great one. As you can see, people were interpreting the term map pretty broadly. But it was, it was an inspiration. It was a prompt. It was a creative prompt, right? And so this map maker, Emily in Massachusetts, is playing with that way that so much of life was just collapsing onto the screen. And so these are the names of her different friends, and they're living all over the world during the pandemic. And they're all in their kind of Brady Bunch Zoom squares, but instead of their faces, it's little abstracted maps of where they are in the world. And so it really plays up that idea of how, abstract the concept of, Paris or even Harvard, Massachusetts might have felt as someone living not there during the pandemic when things really were so distant. Natural connections. So this is a couple of maps by Rick Bohannon in Minnesota, who mapped the weekly bird walks that he was taking as a little bit of a respite from lockdown life. So walking around a pond, and he's captioning where he sees different birds, and you just kind of get a sense, right? Week 1 in mid-March, week 3 in early April. This is something he continued to do. And it just feels like this was a way for him to sort of track the passage of time, right? In this upside down moment. Another one, you saw this in the video too, Champ Turner's maps of his different routes he would take to the creek where he lives in Austin. Another fantasy map, but this one from the perspective of a dog named Max. So the Woods of Insanity and Kitty Cat Hideaway and the Tree of Marked Territory. Again, this map maker, Laurie Mellier, really getting creative and just, shifting her perspective. She's literally, taking putting herself in the paws of her dog, I suppose, to think about what the world is looking like for him. And then psychological landscapes. So again, this was, map makers who used our project as a prompt, as an opportunity to kind of dump the contents of whatever was happening for them psychologically and kind of emotionally, right? And I think you see that in different ways in all of the maps, but some of these maps were just really kind of metaphorical and creative. And so this is Lydia Way, who spent her entire first year at Stanford University at her parents' house in Maryland, had never set foot on the campus until just this past year. And so this is her map from 2020. And she's really, again, it's sort of a fantasy map, but it's almost like psychedelic and kind of crazy. But she really just leans into this idea that, like, I've never seen my college campus. I've never been there. It could look like anything. And so I'm just going to map it as if it's just the craziest version of what it could possibly be. And so Stanford Campus of the Unknown is what she has here. And it's just, I think it's just great. So a lot of these maps that you've been seeing, of course, do have this kind of creative and sort of like bright aesthetic. And we did see a lot of that. But I do want to underscore that there were also some really difficult emotions and really difficult experiences, that stem from that trauma and uncertainty and grief that was pretty pervasive, by summer 2020. For so many of us, whether that's from the isolation of having to stay at home all the time, like this map of Lisa Drury's, I think really sheds light on that. She's mapping her alone in COVID experience in Ontario. And I just think this is so kind of heart-wrenching of, she's mapping the streets she wanders where she hopes to run into another human. Train tracks to Toronto, a place fading from my memories. You just really get this sense of desolation and solitude and loneliness that is, I think, was pretty pervasive and remains so, I think, in a lot of ways. This is another one of the maps that have really stayed with me. I had the chance to talk to this map maker, Lewis McNair in California, who was a college senior when COVID hit. And so he was finishing his senior year of college on the track and field team, and COVID hits. And it's really just like the rug is pulled out from under his feet because suddenly he can't graduate with his friends. Suddenly he can't, compete in that last track and field meet. And he's still working a full-time job as a grocery clerk. And so this map is, I just think, so powerful. It shows his commute to work, but over this kind of like landscape of increasingly panicked language. And you literally see that the way his kind of letters become shaky and uncertain, and the words like stress and panic and all of these experiences that were very real for him. I just find really powerful as an insight into that experience. Noah Tang, a high school teacher in Illinois, who sent this map of 30 empty desks in his classroom in fall 2020, and who wrote really poignantly about just how sad it was for him as a teacher who really values that kind of physical connection that you get from being in a classroom with your students, which was not to be found that semester. Another one of these really kind of heavy maps from a woman named Jean Brown in Illinois, who's contrasting the kind of somewhat vibrant life, that she was able to create in Chicago during the pandemic with the kind of world that her mother, who was living with Alzheimer's, was living in Ohio. And, she'd have these visits where, they'd have these sort of distant, visitations, and it was heartbreaking. And that's the name of this map, Heartbreak 2020. And I think you really feel that taking it in. Susan Sullivan, writing from California, or mapping from California. This is actually a sketch that she made in preparation for a work of ceramic art. She's a ceramicist, and she's this is from late 2020. So this was kind of like a recap of the whole year, where she's mapping COVID stuff, but also there's Black Lives Matter Boulevard because of the George Floyd protests that were happening that year. There's also the flames of the wildfires that were so severe in the West Coast that year. And so just kind of meditating on this kind of contraction of a year. We did have a couple map makers who took this as like a data mapping like assignment. So an incredibly serious way. Jake Kevin Byrne in Minnesota mapped a data set that he downloaded from the Minneapolis Police Department. So these are like police encounters in the same neighborhood where George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, and bordered with photos from the protests. I think this is the last one of my map slides. So this is, again, you saw this in the map, but I just think it was a nice like sub-genre of the maps we received, where people were taking the opportunity in some cases to think about what happens next after the pandemic. How do we sort of rebuild from here? What can we make better? What can we improve? And so he thought about, what would a fantasy metro system, transit system in the city of Miami look like after all of this? Because he didn't have a car, and that was really hard during the pandemic when he was unable to see his family and friends. And so he thinks of transit, as a way to maybe improve those connections in the future. So just this incredible collection that I really just sped through and touched on in just the briefest way. There's many more of those maps in the book that we published, 65 of them, some of them which were never published previously as part of this project. So really encourage you to take a look if you're interested in learning more and seeing more of these stories. But I think that, by the end of the summer, we just received all these maps from all over the world, and it became clear to us that, this was more than just an audience engagement project. This was really, as Libby was saying, we had kind of this like primary source archive on our hands of really primary source documents of what it was like to live through the pandemic, which, as Libby was saying, is not something that you necessarily get in a lot of material archives. So these maps really were windows into people's lives. And I also thought about, why did this project resonate with so many people? And just briefly, I think that a lot of the changes that you see reflected and sort of meditated on these maps are spatial in nature. Whether you're thinking about, now I literally don't commute anymore. I just stay at home to do a lot of my job, or spatial in nature in the sense of like, I have to maintain a 6-foot distance between myself and another person, to, thinking about the ways borders were shut down, or the ways that, the neighborhood suddenly became maybe your more, day-to-day unit of travel or kind of geographic experience. I don't know. So there was just a lot of kind of geography-based changes at work that I think maps really kind of plugged into nicely. But then I think too, the assignment itself of asking people to do this and be part of this project, I do think was therapeutic. I think we heard that from a lot of readers who participated. It was a chance to sit down and process, something that was really traumatic and came with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of kind of ever shifting change. And so I think by making maps, it did give people an opportunity to sort of, at least for a moment, pin down what's happening and kind of process. And then, yeah, again, this kind of collection, in total became this real window, I think, into what people all over the world were experiencing on an emotional level. So that was really special. And I think it became clear to us that this should have a more permanent home, beyond the online galleries that we created, as beautiful as they are. And so that was really the origin of this book project. So it took a while, but last month we published the Quarantine Atlas, Mapping Global Life Under COVID-19, with Black Dog and Leventhal. And so it is now available everywhere books are sold. It is a beautiful book. I should have a copy next to me to show, but it's not quite coffee table size. You can really hold it in your hands, which I think is lovely, and look at these maps in full color. And alongside the maps, there's also 8 essays by really wonderful writers, including Jenny Odell and Jeff Maynaw, who write exquisitely about those geographic changes, really about how the pandemic has reshaped the places we lived and reshaped our relationships to them. So if you're interested in this project, I really would encourage you to pick up your own copy. This is just me flipping through. That's my introduction. So yeah, it's beautifully designed, thanks to our wonderful publisher, Black Dog and Leventhal. Why can't I get away from these videos? Okay, this is just from our Amazon book page, just giving you a little bit more insight into the book. If you do pick up a copy and you feel so inclined, please do leave us a review. That is good for our algorithm and will help connect more people to this project. Quarantine Atlas, there it is. And that is it. That is it. I encourage you, book or no book, our project is ongoing. So I should have a link for this, which I can send around after the talk, but we are still collecting maps. So, and as part of our sort of efforts to create a more permanent home for this collection, we are in talks with some pretty amazing libraries and institutions to actually create like an archive where these maps will be available to researchers for years and years to come. And so we are still collecting your maps. And so we encourage you to get in touch. Again, I'll find a link for that before the end of this talk. But tweet at us, #QuarantineAtlas. We welcome your thoughts, your questions, your feedback. That's my Twitter handle @Ms. Laura Bliss. And you can find CityLab and all of its amazing work on Twitter and Instagram there. And that is it. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Laura, thank you so much. As people populate questions in the Q&A button, so if you just want to enter questions in the Q&A right at the bottom of your screen, one of the things that I've been noticing, I would love to be able to say like the further we get from the pandemic, but we're still in it. And so have you found or I should say, at least what I've been seeing with COVID related projects, my own included. And it seems like this stuff is really raw for people right now. Like I noticed myself, even when you were showing the maps, and some of them, the ones that most closely spoke to my experience, having kids that didn't really go to school for a year and a half, having, limited access to places you usually go. Like I feel emotional just looking at them. And how do you think that's going to impact the way people engage with the book? Is this a book for now? Is this a book for later?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it's one that, I think I've grappled with over the course of the book project, because when you set out to make a book, the lead times are long. And so we kind of always knew that, like, okay, this is a project that really speaks to this incredibly, profound, emotional, traumatic, like contraction of a moment. That's the word I keep kind of want to come back to, because it was so visceral. And what does it mean to sort of make a time capsule out of it in a way, when it's not going to be available for another year plus or year and a half. And so, but I think my expectation, and just as an individual experiencing the pandemic too, like, yeah, I feel pretty fatigued. I feel that just exhaustion of kind of thinking about some of the changes that, are all over this book and are all over the maps and essays in it. And so, I think my expectations upon the publication of this book was that, like, okay, people might not be jumping out of their seats to go, dive back into this kind of difficult headspace, right? And not kind of difficult, like really difficult headspace at that time, which is still ongoing, as you say. But I do, it's my hope, I should say, like, that this can be a touchstone, whether it's for a researcher in the future or for just anybody, like me or you, who's looking to reflect on this moment, and not only what it was like for them personally, but I think that one thing I have taken away from sitting down with this book, 2 years after the start of this project, and really looking at these maps and essays with somewhat fresh eyes, is that moment, while it was so full of grief and uncertainty and trauma, it also did reveal the way the world could change in the blink of an eye, in some positive ways too, right? In terms of the way people connected with nature and their neighborhoods, and sort of had these reconsidered relationships, with both people and the places they live. I do think that there's some powerful lessons in that, since not a lot has changed permanently 2 years later. But I do think there's some powerful lessons to draw from that.
One of the things we're going to do at USM, we have ordered a whole bunch of copies of the Atlas, and we're going to put them out to faculty and staff and students in the fall, and just have a series of kind of lunchtime discussions. Because one of the things that really strikes me is that these will be a way for people to talk about and process grief and trauma. Like, we have noticed that with maps, with other events, and in teaching too, that maps can help people remember. Like, they're such interesting tools for memory work, but also they give you something tangible to talk about. That's not, you're talking about someone else's experience, but also connecting to your own. So I'm really excited to use it
that's great
in that way, and to see what comes of it. So we've got some great questions coming in. Erica wants to know, are there any posters that are going to be printed of the maps?
That's a great question. We do not currently have posters available. No. We did do a little limited run of postcard editions for people who pre-ordered the book. I don't know if we're still doing that, but yeah, currently no, but that's a great idea.
Postcards are a great idea. I'm a huge postcard fan, but that's a terrific idea. I think also Star wants to know, do you envision a sequel to this? If you're still collecting maps, is the next stage the building of the physical archive somewhere, or will there be another book?
I don't think there'll be another book, but we are continuing to build this collection for an archive. We 99% know where that's going to be, but I can't really say yet. But they will have a permanent home, and they will be accessible to anybody who wants to look at them and do research with them. And so yeah, that's very exciting. But and we will. I should say too, we're continuing to collect maps, and we are continuing to periodically publish them on CityLab. So sequels in that sense, for sure.
That's great. And when you collected the maps and people gave them to you, did they give you, I guess once you send them to Bloomberg, you like give the rights for the maps to have another life in an archive? So will it be something that continues to be accessible to people in that way?
Accessible.
Did they send you the physical maps, or did they send you images of the maps?
People just sent images. Yeah,
okay.
We didn't receive any physical maps as far as I know. But no, it's the map makers still hold the copyright to their work. We do, when you submit a map, you do fill out a little survey and give us permission, to publish and use the maps. For the archives, I don't want to get too far in the legal.
No. But that's so interesting. So it's not a physical, it's archive. It'll be a digital one.
Correct. It is a digital archive. Yeah. Right.
Oh, that's great. Jim wants to know, and maybe if you can recall, or we can dig around on the website, do you know if there were any maps submitted from Maine?
Oh, it's a good question. I think so. I cannot think of one off the top of my head, but I feel very sure that there was at least one.
If you're on if you're in the curated part of the website that is this, can you search by place, or you go through by the theme?
The
curated by theme
gallery I showed is organized by theme. And I will say, we have well over 500 maps, probably close to 600 at this point. And so in terms of the number we published, in whether that's on the website or in the book, it's really just a tip of the iceberg. So it's possible we have a map from Maine that was not published, but remains within our collection, and will be part of this archive that we're creating.
That goes forward. Awesome. One of our attendees would like to know, what was the prompt that you provided to the mappers, and how did you encourage people to participate, even those who maybe didn't feel like they were artists or map makers or were artistically inclined?
Yeah, let me try to find the original prompt. It sort of changed over time. Let me see. April 2020. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find the original off the top of my head. I'm sorry, I have to do a little bit of Googling to find that original April 2020 post. But I mean, it was, pretty broad. It was share with us in a map, what your world looks like right now. I created an example. So we did publish that, which was a very, speaking of unartistically inclined, very rough, I did it on like an iPad, but equivalent to like Microsoft Paint, squiggles, just showing my neighborhood where I live, and kind of I pinpointed like, this is the little coffee shop, this is the park I go to, this is where, some neighbors I'm worried about live. And that was kind of it. And I think we suggested like, maybe there was like, how are you reconnecting with your neighborhood? Or, what does it feel like to be inside all the time? So I think there was some suggestions, but people really responded to it in their own way. And then in terms of the, how do we encourage people who were not artistically inclined? We did one of the map labs, like editions of the newsletter I write in the last couple of months. Maybe this was from December or January, but we did a little Q&A with Peter Conrad, who was one of the map makers whose map you saw. That was like the first kind of dollhouse cutaway, just the two of us map. He's submitted 3 maps to this project over the last 2 years. So he's been like our #1 participant. And it's been fascinating because you've just kind of seen how his experience has changed over time. And he's also an artist. He creates his own comic books. And so we did a little Q&A with him, and he really gave some great advice about how, part of making something creative is just kind of pushing away those critics, those inner critics, and just trying something and testing something out. So happy to share the link to that if that's of interest.
That'd be great. It would be great to hear someone talk about that. There was someone who wanted to know earlier, you mentioned that there were 8 essays in the book written by different authors. Can you talk a little bit about sort of, do the essays speak to the maps you published, or are they like parallel reflections?
1 second, I'm going to drop the link in here right now. This is the interview with Peter Conrad. I'm sorry, can you restate the question?
With the essays,
Yes.
So you mentioned that there are 8 in the book, and someone wanted to know a little bit more about them. Do they run parallel to the map? So are the essays about the maps that were published, or are they more of a general discussion at the time?
Yeah, they are related to the themes, I would say. So yeah, and loosely. So, when I went to kind of commission these different essays with their respective authors, I sort of tried to sort of guide the writer into thinking about, like Jeff Manos is a great example. He's the author of The Burglar's Guide to the City, and he just co-wrote with his wife earlier this year or last year, Safe, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the title, but it's a history of quarantine, actually, that they started writing before the pandemic. So it's crazy. He's a great writer. His essay is about how the sort of architecture of COVID-19 and like the, social distancing stickers on the sidewalk, and the way, the little parklets that sprung up on sidewalks outside of restaurants to do outdoor dining, and, the way parks and kind of public spaces became so much more important and central in neighborhood life. So he really writes beautifully about that. And that was kind of in response to like this, redefining boundaries prompt. And then Jessica Martin, who was the audience engagement editor, who really co-led the CityLab side of this project with me, writes a really beautiful essay about having a toddler and being pregnant and working a full-time job, and just the real challenges and emotional difficulties of surviving, especially that first year. And so yeah, they don't necessarily speak to specific maps, but they really do, I think, stitch together this broader story that is told about how the pandemic changed places and our relationships to them.
There are a variety of different disaster archive projects happening at NYU and elsewhere, where librarians and archivists are trying to actually capture the number of community archives and projects like this that were made all over the world during COVID. And one of the things that strikes me about this moment, and your project too, is that we really will have an unprecedented, intentional collection of personal narratives around a shared experience. Unlike, just as from a historian's perspective, unlike anything else. And I mean, for me, one of the things that prompted me to start the Signs of the Times archive was that, when I teach something like the 1919 flu pandemic, which killed millions of people, it's nearly impossible. There's some photographs, you can find it in the newspapers, but when you look for a narrative of personal reflection, there are diaries, there are a couple letters, it's just not there. It's like the trauma of living through it made it impossible for people to talk about. And then they moved into the Roaring 20s. Like there was so much a response to the loss of World War I and the incredible, immense losses of the pandemic that followed. So to me, I really do wonder what future historians and future scholars are going to do with this. What do you hope people take from this book in the future? Like, what do you hope it leaves for them to help figure out?
That's a good question. No, I think it is so interesting comparing our modern, experience of this pandemic to the one that happened a century ago. Like we do live in this, we're such a self-conscious society, in our social medias and everyone's a celebrity kind of culture, there is so much kind of sharing and broadcasting, from this kind of personal perspective. And so it will be a really different experience for historians and researchers to kind of sift through. It's a lot more, I imagine. But yeah, I don't know. I think in terms of what I hope people to take away in the future, I do think that these maps are, there will be a lot of that kind of, social media ephemera and people talking about it and this kind of thing. But I do think these maps are unique. I think maps are so evocative, as you were saying earlier. They provide that sort of empathic connection, I think, in a way that other mediums do not necessarily. So I'm sort of struggling to articulate a good response to this, but I do think that these maps are a unique window into that emotional experience that other, archival objects may not necessarily convey in the same way. So yeah, I hope it's useful for that. And also, yeah, as a memory tool, like you were saying earlier, if someone is trying to tell, a grandchild or, younger person about what this experience was like, I think this can be a way in for that too.
It's the thing, my previous life is photo. I'm a photo historian. And in my, life with maps over the past 5 years, I have been so taken with just how much emotion is in maps. And I'm really struck by these, particularly the ones that are handmade and hand drawn, like the emotion that actually lives in the making.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be a new arena for people really in moving in that direction. So I'm excited by what that brings. And I'm hopeful also that as people are more ready to process the trauma that's ongoing, I really also hope that books like this and projects like this are tools of processing that trauma that can really help people talk about their own experiences as they move forward. So I think this book is amazing. I'm so excited to read the essays. And I think it is one of those things that will take on more importance as people are ready for it and can reach for it and can open it and are ready to deal with, I think, things that people have just locked away. I got the email this afternoon that my child's school is closed tomorrow because of staffing and COVID issues. And I'm like, no, I can't do this again. One day is fine, but it's very much with us. And I think that the visceral nature of these maps just make them very different kinds of documents that will continue to have a rich life and a lot of rich use for people. So grateful you could be with us tonight. We've been trying to do this for a long time. Thank you so much for letting us record. There's so many people who want to listen to this talk and to watch it. So I'm excited to share it with people. And thank you for continuing the project. I'm really excited that it's still ongoing and that the archive will be more than a website. I think it's a lot of foresight to really say, what does it look like to take this sort of off the platform we created it on and put it in a place where people will continually encounter it over time? It's exciting.
Thank you so much, Libby. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you so much for making this happen. And I'm so excited to hear that you're grabbing some copies and trying to make this available to the wider community at the university. So that's great. Thank you so much for that.
Stay tuned. I will let you. I'm going to ask one of my colleagues in public health and maybe one in social work who's versed in trauma to help some of the discussions. So
yeah, let me know how that goes.
I will. Yeah. And we thank you on behalf of the whole staff here and everyone who tuned in tonight, and we will talk soon. Thank you everybody so much. Thanks to all who joined, and go enjoy this beautiful evening.
All right. Enjoy.
Thanks,
Bye.
Laura.
Thank you so much.